Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 1st of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important, the most interesting updates are coming, of course, from Belgorod. We discussed the situation in the previous video. I'll remind you that this morning the Ukrainians made a small offensive operation in this area, trying to penetrate the defense orders and to capture the settlements along the Russian-Ukrainian border. I'm talking about Novotavlazhanka and Shebekino. During the day we got a lot of updates from this area. For example, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings in this area, the Ukrainians lost 30 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system Grad. There were at least 3 waves of attacks, and there were a lot of very interesting updates about that attack, that attempt. And the most interesting is that, for example, the Russians published a very interesting video. This is the video, and on that video you can see that there was some kind of explosion in the forest line, this area. And basically, based on that video confirmation, we see that Ukrainians managed to get this line. So probably using their own eyes, they were able to see the settlement. So the Ukrainians, as a result of morning attack, managed to cross the border and to get and probably to enter the outskirts of this settlement. And probably the main thing that Ukrainians were trying to achieve by that attack is to establish control over this bridge, this one, because this is the only bridge that the Ukrainians, that the Russians could use for supplying and supporting their forces that located in Novotavlazhanka, this one. And the Russians reported there were 2 waves of attack, not 3 waves of attack that were made by 2 squads. So that was the first squad who managed to get this area. This squad passed by this small office, the border office, that it was like mechanized parts, mechanized squads. They entered this forest line, and from that forest line they started shelling and attacking the Russian positions and the settlement, let's say from the south or from the east. And another squad moved from a small settlement like Agurtsova, this Agurtsova, from this direction. They moved in direction of Novotavlazhanka. Both those attacks were repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians, as a result of those clashes, were forced to step back. But anyway, we see that the Ukrainians do have possibilities to achieve success and do have possibilities to do such kind of operations. And as the previous attack that took place in the middle of May in direction of Kozinka and Gryanova, the Russian Volunteer Corps, Russian Democratic Republic forces was the main squads that took participation in that operation. But after the Ukrainians were forced to step back on the territory of Ukraine, they started artillery shelling and bombing the entire front line, the entire border line. There were explosions on the west-north, there were explosions in Kozinka and the west from Belgorod. There were explosions on the line from Novotavlazhanka, Nichayevka and Shebekino. Furthermore, the Russians published a video of results of one of those attacks. As you can see, a big 5-floor high-rise building, 5-floor buildings were under fire. And later the Russians published that there was an explosion in the central part of Belgorod. That was the drone who was flying above that settlement. Probably the Russians managed to shut that drone down, and when the drone fell, there was an explosion. As you can see, there is a smoke in this area. So this is about Belgorod and Belgorod region. And there are also 2 interesting updates about this territory. We discussed yesterday in the previous videos that all this entire situation could happen and currently can continue the same way is because of the Ukrainians during the previous weeks redeployed artillery brigade to this area. And when talking about the current situation, there is 47th Artillery Brigade somewhere in the vicinity of Kharkiv, newly redeployed 55th Artillery Brigade somewhere between Kupiansk and, let's say, Kharkiv. Furthermore, there used to be, or at least probably there are still, 27th Rocket Artillery Brigade. And today the Western sources are saying that as a result of redeployment process, the Ukrainians also moved 4th Artillery Brigade to this area as well. So as you can see, currently there are at least 4 artillery brigades, and 3 of those brigades are classic artillery brigades and 1 brigade is rocket artillery brigade. So as you can see, this is the reason why the Ukrainians increased the pressure, and using this bridgehead, as we discussed, the Ukrainians can attack Belgorod, can attack, let's say, Valuki, this settlement, this area, and currently using this bridgehead, the Ukrainians have possibilities to stop, suppress, and pin down the Russian forces on the Kupiansk front line, where the Russian forces currently are advancing. You might ask, so what is the reason of this redeployment? What is the reason of such a heavy artillery pressure in this area and so on? And some of you can say that probably, as we discussed, the Ukrainians want to capture this bridgehead in the vicinity of Shebekino, this one, and like to force the Russians to move forces to this area with one purpose, let's say, to reduce some power of Russian forces on other front lines like Zaporozhye or Donetsk. Probably the Ukrainians want to create a buffer zone and so on. But to tell the truth, I believe that for these purposes, the Ukrainians first of all need to redeploy tank brigades, not just mechanized brigades and artillery brigades, because only using tanks and massive tank attack, you can penetrate this area and to capture this territory. But we see that Ukrainians are not redeploying tanks. So probably there are at least 2 goals that Ukrainians are trying to achieve by attacking Belgorod and by intensifying their activity in this area. The first one goal, the most obvious, is that to force the Russians to move reserves in this area. But we understand that the Russians are not going to use neither strategical nor tactical reserves to prevent Ukraine activity in this area. They're going to use just the local resources, local forces, probably some forces from the Kupiansk front line, and that's it. So what is the next reason why the Ukrainians are doing this activity on the border? And of course, the main reason of the Ukrainians is to force the Russians to redeploy in this area the forces who can use drones. We see that currently this area is overpopulated with Ukrainian artillery, and the Russians can't attack these artillery systems using some commandos or, let's say, massive tank attack. Of course, all these attacks will be repulsed on the border. So the only possible solution for the Russians to destroy artillery systems is to use drones like Lancet, and this is the main important thing that Ukrainians want to do. Currently, the Russians need those Lancet forces somewhere in Zaporozhye area, probably in the vicinity of Donetsk. So as we can see, completely on the opposite front lines in comparison with Kharkiv front line, and the Ukrainians want to force the Russians to move Lancet forces to the north. Of course, I believe that the Russians will be forced to do this, and soon we are going to see this video of massive Lancet attack in the vicinity of Kharkiv. But this action will reduce the Russian power and Russian mighty on the south, where the Ukrainians are planning to start using the newly created and brigades with the Western weapon. And believe me, and this is true, that the Ukrainians do really, and the Western countries do really afraid of Russian Lancet, Russian drone forces, because as soon as the Western weapon will appear on the ground, they are going to become the most wanted targets for the Russian drone forces, for those forces who can attack the Ukrainians using Lancet drones and the drones of that type. So this is the main important reason of the Ukrainian activity in Kharkiv, to force the Russians to move Lancet forces to the north. I'm calling these forces Lancet because of for better explanation. Probably these forces have different types of drones that they can use to attack the Ukrainians in this area. Now we're moving to Kupiansk. As you can see, one more time, currently there are at least 3 artillery brigades in this area, but these artillery brigades can't stop the Russian advances in direction of Kupiansk. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in this area, and some official sources from this area confirmed and reported that the Russians got the outskirts of Kupiansk. There were no updates about establishing control over Sinkovka, so probably there are still a lot of things to do from the the Russian side, but we understand that without taking Sinkovka, we are not going to see any fightings for Kupiansk, because only using this bridgehead on the south of Sinkovka, the Russians will be able to move their tanks, and from these positions they will be able to start shelling and attacking and supporting the storm squads in this area. So this is the situation. Yes, the Russians do have progress in the forest, but they still haven't captured Sinkovka, and currently this is the main objective of the Russian in this area. The Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of fierce fightings on this front line, the Ukrainians lost 45 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. There were no updates from the Ministry of Defense about active storming clashes during the previous 24 hours. Now we're moving further and we are going to the Liman front line. We received some updates from this area. The Ministry of Defense reported that during the previous 24 hours they attacked the Ukrainians' ammo depot. They destroyed the ammo depot of 125th Territory Defense Brigade in Serebryanka, and the Russians hit the positions of 81st Brigade. This is 81st Air Mobile Brigade, who is currently located in Belgorod, and this is their main area of responsibilities. So we see that the Russians continue pressure in this area, trying to destroy the main supply roads. The Russians are trying to attack the main reserves, and as you can see, before today, the Russians were mainly focused on positions of 54th in Verkhnyokamyansk and Belgorovka, and now the Russians started attacking the Ukrainian forces in Seversk. That means that the Russians changed their focus from their main position, from the main forces on the combat line to the reserves in Seversk. What does it mean? That means that the Russians understand that soon there are going to be rotation process between the squads on the combat line and in reserves in Seversk, and currently the Russians are trying to break and to ruin the rotation process for this 81st Brigade. And as we remember, this is the classical story of Ukrainian war in this area. This is their main pattern. As soon as some squads haven't received a normal rotation, they drop their position, leave their position, and at this point the entire Russian offensive operation begins. So probably this is exactly what the Russians are trying to implement on this front line. Some updates are coming from Sporna, and today the Russian sources reported that the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainians' defense orders in this area and to capture the first ruins of buildings in the eastern part of that settlement. There were no updates about further progress to the west. Probably the Russians have already established entire control over this settlement, but for now we see that they have entered and they continue pushing, and the next target is going to be Ivano-Darivka and Vyimka. The Ministry of Defense reported that the total losses of the Ukrainians on the Liman front line were around 80 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. As you can see, a level of loss has been a little bit increased in comparison with the previous days, but yet the level is not so strong, it's not so big in comparison with the active phase of Bakhmut storming offensive operation. When talking about Bakhmut, there were no updates. The only one we discussed, that 40th artillery brigade that used to be located in this area during the active phase of storm of Bakhmut process, was redeployed in direction of Kupiansk front line. So currently there are still at least 2 brigades like 45th and 43rd, but probably these brigades and 107th Rocket Artillery Brigade, but probably those brigades will be redeployed as well, because neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are planning to restore any activity in this area until at least fall of Seversk, or let's say the fall of Kremenная Forest front line. Now we're going to Bakhmut and to Donetsk, The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation for the 3rd time in a row report that there are very fierce fightings in Avdiivka and very fierce fightings in Marinka. The Russians, the squads of the 1st Military Corps in Avdiivka continue advancing in the area of that settlement, but we still haven't received any confirmation from anyone, neither from Ministry of Defense or from the local officers on the ground or press on the ground, about which trenches, which forest lines, which settlements, which buildings were captured during the previous 3 days. So we don't know. We just can project and speculate on that topic and to build our own projections about possible movements. For now, we don't have any information neither from Avdiivka nor from Marinka. When talking about Marinka, today we got a video from the head of Chechensky Special Unit Akhmat. He reported about local situation. So currently we understand that those forces have been redeployed in this area. They're saying that 70% of that Marinka settlement was captured by 150th Motorized Division and 5th Motorized Brigade plot, and currently there are still left 30% of Marinka, and based according to his words, this 30% of Marinka will be captured and is the job to be captured for the special unit Akhmat. But as we discussed, no changes on the ground. The only interesting thing that the Russians report about destroyed of another ammo depot in Georgievka, so we assume that those ammo depots belong or either to 35th Marine Brigade or to 79th Air Assault Brigade, who is currently trying to hold the Russian pressure in this area. Now we're moving further to the south, Donetsk and Zaporozhye area. There were no changes on the ground. The only interesting update that the Russians, as a result of air defense, managed to destroy another Su-25 in the vicinity of Orekhov. The total losses of the Ukrainians on this front line during the previous 24 hours were around 120 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. As you can see, there are not many changes on the ground, and probably we discussed that the main reason of the attacks and activity of the Ukrainians in Belgorod is to force the Russians to move some squads, some probably drone forces from this bridgehead, and probably after that the Ukrainians are going to launch their offensive operation. Now we're moving further to the south and going to talk a little bit about Kherson. We haven't received any updates. The only thing that the Ukrainians during the previous day attack and were trying to attack and destroy the Russian position on this side, but those were regular artillery duels without any attempts to cross or to do something new in this area. The Ukrainians lost during the previous 24 hours 20 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles. As you can see, no changes in comparison with the previous weeks. So this is about the situation on the ground. Now let's talk a little bit about political events, and the most important one is that the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, today visited Moldova, and he's not the only one who visited Moldova today. As you know, also the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak, also visited that country. As you can see, we have added another icon, new icon of Sandu Maya, the president of Moldova. So that was some kind of unofficial meeting of NATO, unofficial meeting where these people and many other people were trying to resolve a lot of questions, and the Russian sources are saying that the main thing that Zelensky wanted to discuss with Maya Sandu, the president of Moldova, is the Transnistrian crisis. Of course, we understand that Zelensky needs to get more weapons, needs to get more missiles, and he still has a lot of Soviet equipment, and he needs to supply and support those Soviet weapons. And the easiest solution for him is to capture the warehouses in Transnistria, ex-Soviet warehouses in the vicinity of settlement Kolbasna. And after that meeting, the president of Moldova, Maya Sandu, reported that it's her words: if it is necessary for the Ukrainian army, we are ready to give the right to enter our territory in order to deal with warehouses, weapons and personnel. This is an allied gesture. So as you can see, we understand that she was talking about the warehouses, ex-Soviet warehouses on the territory of Transnistria, and probably Zelensky, Sanda Mayo and Rishi Sunak solved all questions, signed every single document, and probably the beginning of the Ukrainian greatest counter-offensive operation will be started in Transnistria, in this territory where the Ukrainians will try to capture the warehouses and so on. If you ask my opinion, I'll tell you that probably this is going to be like this, because the Ukrainians are not ready to start offensive operation on the south. They see the results of their offensive operation in Belgorod, and we know that the NATO summit meeting is going to take place in the Baltic states on the 20th of June. So they need to start something right now. They need to show the results before that meeting, because as I know, the Western countries are going to announce about the greatest aid help to Ukraine. And to do this, of course, the best thing is to have some results from the Ukrainian side on the ground. And Transnistria is a very nice area to show such results and to show progress. And let's say, I believe that this is going to happen in these months. And of course, based on the words of the president of Moldova, we see that there is some negotiation process and they have already solved the issues between the sides. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.